We'll use the mic. Welcome, everyone. The reason we're here tonight is it's an informational meeting, and appreciate everybody coming, and we thought it would be best, all the boards or anyone interested, to get a firsthand account of projections on the 5-year budgeting and what we see coming as of April 1st of 26 as far as the changes and what the 4 remaining entities will be looking at financially for their portion moving forward. This meeting is strictly informational. There's nothing else as far as business that's going to be handled tonight. That's all there will be. And I want to thank you for coming, and we'll get started here with roll call, please.
Gatlin? Here. Sportel? Here. Keller?
Here.
Tomlinson?
Here.
Nastenbrook here. Smith? Here. All present.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to introduce Rod Taylor from Manor and Consortium, and he has put together our 5-year plan and has a presentation that we've asked him to come to present to all of the members. Okay.
Just so everybody's aware, the presentation, PowerPoint will be up on the big screen so you can see it from there.
Yep. I'll let him get down here. Okay, and then also as part of this meeting, the village has offered to record it, and it will be available on YouTube. So my understanding, it's being streamed live, and then also it's available on YouTube after the completion of the meeting.
You just have to go to the Village of Vicksburg, their YouTube channel, and it should be on there.
And with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Taylor, and he's the center of our attention for this evening.
All right. Good evening. Hopefully I got everybody's attention. Again, my name's Rod Taylor. I work for a company called Manor Consortium. Before we kind of get into the agenda and talking about our goals and objectives today, just a background on who I am, so you know who's speaking to you this evening. I've spent the last approximately 30 years in municipal government, so I've worked in a city, a county, a township, as well as I worked for the state of Michigan, an administrator working with local governments, focusing on education, assistance, and statutory compliance. So I come from a background of focusing on municipal governments. At the firm, I was brought in to grow and expand our government consulting business. So this is the kind of work that we do, working with communities that have challenges, have opportunities, looking for some additional information so they can make better decisions. Ultimately, I think the goals and objectives of all our municipal governments is to make the best decisions possible for our citizens, and they do that by using good planning, good information, thoughtful conversation, and having a strategic direction. And so clearly, having the board bringing in an outside expert helps them achieve their goals and objectives. In today's agenda, what we're going to go through is we're going to start with some goals of the project, so we kind of understand what questions we have and how that information might help answer those questions. Talk a little bit about the current funding model, so we're all on the same page of how expenses are split between the municipalities. Talk about fund balance. This is a measure of fiscal health, so this is really a critical decision maker in terms of understanding how the numbers work in the long term. And then the study methodology. How did we come up with the information, the numbers that we have, how are the decisions made, and then ultimately the focus is the findings. So the goals of the project. Now, these are kind of, frankly, my goals for the projects, and I think they hopefully will encompass overall the board's longer objectives. The primary goals are, as mentioned earlier on, is to determine the municipal contributions. Now, I say 2027 here, so just note as we talk about this, 2027 is your fiscal year, so that starts in April of 26, so that we're all on the same page. So when I do 27, because it ends in 27, that's the reason I use that number. So again, the authority is going from 6 to 4, and how's that going to impact the remaining 4? Additionally, there's some discussion of potential new initiatives that the Fire Authority may like to undertake. Those include pay adjustments for existing firefighters, additional staffing, full-time station time so that you increase response time to your community, potentially a need for a new building in the future, as well as ensuring that you're setting aside reserves for capital purchases. And then the last one is impacts on fund balance. So again, understanding how changes are going to occur, how is it going to impact your long-term fiscal sustainability. Secondary goals, I think that are important for any fire authority, would include ensuring that we're maintaining the appropriate level of service within your communities, adequate, high-quality fire and emergency response services. Sustainability, again, one of the things that we always have to think about when we talk about municipal governments is not short-term decisions, but how those short-term decisions impact the long-term. At the state of Michigan, as I mentioned, much of what I did was identifying communities that were struggling financially. And so we want to make sure that we put our municipalities in a position for not only short-term success, but long-term success. We need to strengthen the training, safety, and professional development for our staff members to provide high-quality service. We have to have high-quality trained staff. So I think that's important. Obviously, maintaining compliance with all standards. And then one of the big things that all fire authorities, I was a township manager for 11 years. We had a fire department that was a mix of paid on call as well as full-time staff. And one of the things that even back then was struggling, and even more today, is attracting and retaining fire personnel. So it's a problem that's been going on for a while, and it only continues to move forward. So I think it's just important to recognize that, I was brought on board to help with the primary goals, but there's always other secondary goals that are important to realize and recognize as well. So before I talk specifically about the project that we were charged with, just some background. And that background starts with, well, how do we allocate the expenses between the current municipalities as well as going forward with the 4 remaining? I'm not sure when this exactly occurred, but originally the fire authority contacted an individual named Dr. Harvey. Dr. Harvey was an individual that worked for Michigan State University, and frankly, he's renowned when it comes to helping municipalities. Unfortunately, he's retired now, but he's done some of the best work in the state of Michigan of helping municipalities do these types of things, like forming authorities. An example of his work is there's, over the last 30 years, there's been dozens of municipalities that, for example, have tried to merge together. All of them have failed, except for the one that Dr. Harvey worked on, which was in Iron River in the UP, where I think it's 3 or 4 jurisdictions merged together. And so I highlight that just for the fact that the foundation that you have in terms of how spread cost, I think is extremely strong by the individual that put this together. The current model that you have uses 3 factors to spread cost, and it's weighted, meaning that different factors have different impacts on the total funding. Those include population. So every year the population is reviewed, and based upon population, 30% of the cost is spread based on this factor. And then you have taxable value. Taxable value is your ability to pay. And so what that means is that if you have a community that has a higher taxable value, you have properties that have more value, you then have the ability to capture more tax revenues, thus you have a higher ability to pay for these types of services. And that's 30%. The remaining 40% is usage, and that usage is based upon actually 2 components. One is personnel hours, and the other one is the number of apparatuses that respond to an individual call. So again, that's the formula that's utilized. And one of the questions is, well, is this a good formula? And I think, in my opinion, looking at this, the value the formula has is that it balances the levers that matter in a cost-sharing agreement. And so one is fairness. Fairness means that when we look at, we balance things like usage, that's the historical usage, with, the more that you use, obviously the more that you should pay. We also balance this with size. The bigger population that you have, the potential more need you might have, and so thus we have that factor in here. And the last one is capacity. I've already talked about this is your ability to pay. And so by balancing this, it ensures that we don't have one community that feels like you're subsidizing other communities. The other thing I like about the system that was set up here by Dr. Harvey is transparency. The information that's being used is clear, it's measurable, and it's based on data that's publicly available. And so it's easy for local officials to kind of explain the methodology that's being used to determine who pays what. Additionally, it's predictable. You can look at this and you can potentially predict this out in the future of how it might impact you as in a community. Excuse me. I'm only on the second slide. This might be a long night for you guys. And then the last one is shared ownership. I think one thing that's important to highlight is that when you're an authority, you all have to work together. This formula makes sure that you kind of have that shared responsibility in maintaining the system necessary. Excuse me. So this is kind of a look of how the formula works in real practice. And so this just uses the 4 communities that would remain beginning in April of 26. And we have our factors of population, taxable value, and historical usage. And one of the questions would be raised was, well, should we look at tweaking or changing this formula? And I would say that there's always potential to ask that question and evaluate that. But when I kind of look at the data, I don't see anything that's dramatically skewed between one community and the other. When you look at the population taxable value, there are some consistencies. I think in the future, if you saw some trends that were changing, you might want to look at it in the long term, specifically probably the weights, not necessarily the factors, but maybe the weights. So for example, if you have one community that is driving the majority of historical cost, maybe that weight needs to be increased. Again, I think we have a pretty, when you look at it from a numbers perspective, a pretty fair system here. But if you had a significant change where one community was dramatically having higher usage for a particular reason, maybe that would be valuable. Another reason would be kind of the readiness costs. The readiness costs are all of those costs that are relevant if you receive a call for service or not. The fact of the matter is, when you pick up the phone, you want your fire department to respond. And so to do that, you have to have certain things. You have to have buildings and equipment and staff, whether you have one call or not. And so if you see a heavy reliance on, from a budgetary perspective, those costs dramatically increasing or rising, you might want to look at either increasing the population or taxable values weights. But overall, I think, again, this system is, balances fairness with equity as well as the overall readiness. The only thing that I think is maybe not taken into account when Dr. Harvey did this originally, not that you need a change, is that when we think about fire department, we use the word fire department. But I haven't looked at your data, but I'm probably pretty safe to saying is that the majority of calls aren't fire calls. The majority of calls in most communities are medical. And so when you look at your historical usage, there's probably a different cost factor for responding to a fire call versus a medical call. You could look at potentially, fine-tuning that to recognize the fact. So for example, a medical call, it's usually less people, less equipment that need to go versus, for example, fire calls. Could you potentially use that as a way to fine-tune or adjust that factor? Possibly. I don't think it's really needed, but just trying to think outside the box. All right, next topic. So fund balance. So what is fund balance? I provide this at the beginning because as we get later on and look at the actual analysis, it's really important to understand what fund balance is and how we use that as a driver for decision making. So as I mentioned at the beginning, fund balance is a measurement of fiscal health. And we need to have fund balance. Well, first of all, what is fund balance? So fund balance is basically your accumulation of your reserves over time. So if you go back to the beginning of time, the first year the fire authority existed, you didn't have a fund balance. But if that first year you brought in more money than you had expenditures, let's say you had $100 you brought in, but your expenditures were $90, well, you'd have $10 left over at the end of the year. That $10 stays as your fund balance, and that rolls into next year. And if next year you have the same thing where you have $10 extra, you have $20 at the second year. And maybe the third year, though, your expenses are a little bit higher than your revenues, and so now you use some of that. So let's say you use $5, and so now we're down to $15. So your fund balance is this accumulation of those reserves that you have over time. And the way we calculate that for financial purposes is a ratio. So we look at that ending fund balance, in this case $15, and we divide it by our revenues, and if my revenues were $100, then my ratio is 15%, right? So I have a 15% fund balance. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on in terms of what a appropriate fund balance is. But why do we have a fund balance? Well, there's two purposes. One purpose is unplanned, unexpected events. No matter how good you budget, there are going to be times that things happen that we don't expect. The fire engine, all of a sudden, transmission goes out, didn't anticipate it, you got to fix it because you have to be able to drive that down the road, right? Unplanned, unexpected events. Even though you're doing a great job in maintenance, things then happen. For municipal governments, not so much for the fire authority, you have to keep in mind is that revenues can drop, all right? So if you're a city, if you're a county, if you're a village or a township, your revenues can drop either because taxable value goes down or because the other large source of your revenue comes from the state of Michigan, from sales tax collection. Economy slows, sales tax collection goes down, revenue sharing goes down. And so those are unplanned, unexpected events as well. And so when you lose revenue, you want to make sure you maintain services. You have to have a fund balance to be able to fund those and not dramatically cut and change services. And the other reason you have fund balance is, I mentioned before, it's reserves. You have future projects. This is really critical in a fire authority because you have high reliance on capital purchases, those being your apparatus, and those apparatus are extremely expensive. Fire truck costs $1 million or more today, right? So you can't expect the municipalities in 1 year to be spending, $5,000 a year, and then all of a sudden need to buy a apparatus and tell them now you're going to go from $5,000 to $250,000 a year. They can't adjust for that, right? So by having reserves, you can set some money aside and then make sure that you're able to purchase that equipment when it comes due, and it's easier for the municipalities then to manage that from a cash flow and budgeting perspective. So that's what fund balance. Again, we're going to get into this a little bit later on in more depth, but when we look at your guys' fund balance, what we see is a very positive trend, right? And so when we look at fund balance, there's two things that we usually ask the question, which is, is our fund balance ratio appropriate, and what is my trend? So I can have a very appropriate fund balance ratio, it could be very high as an example, but it's been going down dramatically for a number of years, and if you look at the trend line, you can maybe expect it to continue that, right? In your guys' case, we see the opposite, right? Where you see back in 2015, your ratio was about 45%, and then now we're up to, I should have put the exact numbers on there, but let's say that about 225%. So what that means, again, is that if we think about that ratio, is that if your fund balance was 100%, that means that if you have $100,000 in revenue, then your reserves are $100,000. In other words, you could have zero revenue for 1 year, and you'd still be able to run and operate. 200% means you have twice as much revenue as you have in one potential year. And in your case, you're slightly above that. So that's your trend line, and this will be important again in terms of some of the decision making the board will have going forward. One of the critical questions always is, okay, well, what should our fund balance be? You gave me some numbers, right? It was less than 50%. We're up to 250%. What's the right number? Well, it always depends, right? This is the normal government speak, right? There's no exact magic bullet that you have to have. But every community has to determine what that is for them. But in general, when I think about fund balance, I try to focus the first thought process before you get into depth is, well, what's the median? If I look at other entities, what is the median? Fire authorities, we don't have really a good median to measure to, but the most important point to think about is that you don't want to be in the tails. So in other words, if you're on the far left side, which means your fund balance is extremely low, then what that means is that you're at risk for unplanned, unexpected events, or you're not setting enough money aside to purchase future equipment. If you're on the far right-hand side of it, you think, well, that's great, right? I'm not on the left side, which is dangerous. I'm really well protected from unplanned, unexpected events. I have lots of money for capital equipment, but you have to keep in mind that this is other people's money, right? You don't want to keep too much money. This is taxpayer dollars, and so you have to make sure you kind of balance with being too far on the right, with being too far on the left-hand side. And again, we'll talk a little bit later on in terms of what I think are some recommendations for appropriate fund balance for this potential authority. All right. So the core of what I was asked to do was a financial analysis. Let's look at what we anticipate our revenues and expenditures to be in future years, and then calculate out some projected budgets. And so to do that, we did several things. One is we started with looking at data from 20 to 25, actual historical data of what your revenues and expenditures would be. And then we did some analysis on that using averages for 3 and 6 years, as well as weighted averages for 3 to 6 years. And what that means is, for example, in the weighted average, we look at the more recent years and they have heavier weights because it's probably more likely and predictable of what's been happening. And from that, we were able to take and look at that historical information, historical analysis, and predict what we would think our revenues and expenditures would be in our 2026 fiscal year, which, again, is the fiscal year that you're in currently. This is not your guys' budget, but this is based upon that historical data, what we anticipate to be. That became kind of our base year that we're now able to then build out our potential expectations for those revenues and expenditures in years 2027 to 2036. Each of the line items, so this is just an example here, but there are multiple line items. Line items are where you charge items to or where your revenues come in. This is an example of just a few of those. And so based upon different line items, we then provided some type of escalator. It tended to be about either 3 or 4% based upon historically what we saw those items changing in the past and what we might think that those might change in the future based upon Hicks trends. I did remove information from anything that was identified as Station 3, since that would be going away, because we don't need to have that with the change in municipalities. Now, again, within the analysis, there's assumptions, and I think it's important to kind of be clear what those assumptions are. So, again, we understand the data and the reliability of the data, ultimately. One was, I assumed expenses are going to be consistent, right? So, what do I mean by that? Well, you have a reduction of 2 municipalities. Does that mean that your expenses might go down? You have less communities to serve. Are your expenses to go down? And certainly the answer to that is potentially, absolutely. But it's hard to predict and it's hard to know. And so for analysis purposes, I assumed kind of a straight line that expenses are not going to dramatically drop. And in most cases, most of those aren't going to change, right? Because a lot of your expenses are static. You have staff time. One of the things that's important with a fire department is training, right? And so that training is going to stay the same. No matter if you have any runs next year at all, you still have to train your employees exactly the same amount. You have things like utility bills. You have the inspections that need to be done on your apparatus. All of those things are consistent no matter how many jurisdictions that you have. Now, if you get rid of 3 or 4 fire trucks, certainly that would change, but from what I understanding, you're not going to dramatically change the size of the fleet or not change the fleet. I think the only thing that would be a variable that we could potentially have reduced it by would be your demand time. So when you look at the budget, you have multiple payroll line items. Some of them are things like for education. Some of those are things like demand, which is then your response time. So when a call comes in, this is where that's being charged to. The demand time for the two communities that are leaving made up about 7% of the, or excuse me, demand time makes up about 7% of the overall budget. But when you look at the two communities that are leaving, that was about 30%. So in other words, it's about 2% of the overall budget. So in other words, by not excluding that, it's only going to impact the budget very small by about 2%. So I don't think it's a major concern that we've used a straight line expense consideration. Impacts of mutual aid. You have communities that are leaving, but you have mutual aid that has to occur. And so there may be actually some increased mutual aid for those communities that leave or other communities that we have. I don't know that, and because of that, we can't make a determination. That would, again, raise primarily your personnel payroll cost. So we didn't take that into consideration. As mentioned before, our analysis is for multiple years in the future. We didn't take into account changes in the contribution formula. So taxable value is going to change for each municipality. Population is going to change. Usage is going to change. And so all of those changes is going to impact what a specific municipality is going to have to pay. There's no way to know that, so we can't predict that. But if we look back at the past, I didn't see any dramatic changes in those numbers from year to year. So again, I don't think it's significant. On the assumptions, we had to make some assumptions for these items that I identified as our additions. So these are new expenses that the board may consider in the future, and what those would be. So the first one is wage adjustments. We made an assumption of how much the employees are getting paid now, and then what it would be to move them to approximately $20 an hour and what that would cost. Staff changes. This includes increasing some hours for administrative staff, the professional staff in the office, as well as adding an assistant chief, and then finally increasing the hours for the full-time chief. So those are all baked in under staff changes. And then station time. I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges that we have with our fire departments is attracting and retaining staffing that has a direct impact on ability to respond. And so there's a conversation about increasing, paying and having staff in the buildings on a more regular ongoing basis to ensure that when a call comes in, you have faster response. Obviously, critical for service quality and delivery. Currently, for the 2025 fiscal year, you guys have spent about $32,000 for that. That's a dramatic increase from historically, because historically you did not do this. And so for budgetary purposes, we increased that by about another $30,000, so about double the amount of time we could pay employees to be in the buildings. And the final one is because of changes in demographics within the 4 communities, potentially a need for a new building. You have current debt, and that debt is expiring in 2030, and so I've made a calculation that in 2030 we'd also start adding new debt that would help pay for a new public safety building in the future years. So those are the assumptions that drove into our overall analysis. One of the big challenges that we had in looking at a potential future forecast was your capital improvements plan. Now, first of all, what's a capital improvements plan? Well, a capital improvements plan is a best practice document that, frankly, I go all over the state of Michigan and talk to local governments about how critical and important it is to have a capital improvements plan. Many of them don't do this. You guys have a phenomenal capital improvements plan. And a capital improvements plan is basically, you have all these assets, right? These assets are whether that be, in this case, on the list here, clothing related, right? If you have a firefighter and you want to send them into a firefighter, they have to have a thing called turnout gear. You know, that's the big equipment, the stuff that protects them from the flames. That stuff's very, very expensive, has a certain useful life, and you have to get rid of it and replace it. And we want to make sure that we are setting money aside, right? We talked about fund balance and reserves, so that when that turnout gear needs to be replaced, we can replace it. Our communications equipment that we have to be able to respond and call our firefighters so that they know to come to the station. All of our apparatus, all of those things are things that we don't want to just budget for the now, but we want to make sure that we know what those expenses are in the future so that we can budget for those to have dollars available. This is really, really, really important in our fire departments. I've already established apparatus are outrageously expensive. And so when you have $1 million expenditure, you want to make sure that when that truck comes to the end of its useful life, you're able to purchase that. So you guys have a phenomenal plan, well thought out, well developed plan. And so how does that plan actually work in terms of calculations? Well, one is we have the equipment that we have. So in this case, we have turnout gear. We have the useful life. So in this case, we're saying that, again, this has started in 2016. So this is a accumulation of work that was done back then. But it's going to have a useful life, in this case, 7 years. And then we have how many we need. So in this case, we say we need 35 pieces of this turnout gear. From a math perspective, they take the number that's needed and divide that by the useful life. That gives you the quantity that theoretically you would need to replace every single year. So if we were constantly replacing equipment, then every single year we would have to replace a certain number. And then we have the quantity times the yearly allocation. So we take how many we replace every single year by how much we think it's going to cost to replace them. And so in this case, our turnout gear for 2024 is $2,850. And so that gives us the amount of money that we might need in future years. One of the things that I identified, though, was a gap in terms of what your CIP plan said versus how much you've actually been spending. So your plan is a plan. This is what we anticipate in the future. But if I look at actually what have you been spending on capital purchases, there is a large gap. So for example, if I look at communications, so your plan has a plan for communications, clothing, and equipment, and I look at all the equipment and that are the items that are listed in each of those, the plan says, for example, you need to be setting aside about $220,000 a year just for those future replacements. And the way they came up with that number is, again, they take all of the yearly allocations and they divide it by 20 years. So they're not only looking at what we need to replace next year, but also because prices increase, in this case they use a factor of 2.5%, they're taking that into account, which is exceptional, exceptional work. But for some reason, when you look at that $222,000, the actual historic replacement of those three buckets, communication, clothing, and equipment, was about $77,000 a year, right? So that means that you're planning for $220,000, but you're only actually been spending about $77,000. So why is there a difference? Well, there could be, there's probably multiple reasons, and I'm almost assured that as we go through these, it's probably all four of these items on the list. One is deferred maintenance. Maybe you haven't been replacing some of the stuff when you need to be replacing that. I think with the quality of the CIP plan that you have, this is probably the lowest probability, but when I look at other municipalities across the state of Michigan, this is the number one problem, is that they don't have capital improvements plans, they're not being proactive, and then they don't replace things, and then it becomes more expensive later on. That's called deferred maintenance. So in other words, you have a good plan here, but for example, with my turnout gear, if I say it should be replaced every 7 years, but I decide I don't have the money and I do it every 10 years, that's an example of deferred maintenance. The other one is just simply keeping things longer, right? So, the example that I have here in terms of turnout gear and boots maybe not be a good example, but let's say I have a piece of apparatus and I say that apparatus is going to last 15 years. And you get to the end of the 15 years and you realize that maybe you have a vehicle that's dedicated to brush fires. And maybe you just didn't use it very much over the last 15 years. And so it doesn't have the wear and tear on it that you anticipated. You get to 15 years and it's like, we don't need to replace that, right? So we keep it. That's great because it lowers costs. You're not just being arbitrary and replacing something because a plan says so. You're making an intelligent decision about the need. But what it means is we set that money aside for 15 years and then we didn't spend that money, right? So then in essence, you set aside more money than you actually needed. You don't know that. That's hindsight's 20/20, but that could be an impact. Another reason would be is your needed quantity is too high. So in my example here, we have all this clothing material. We say that we need 35. This is an assumption. Assumptions are dangerous, but I assume 35 probably represents your full staffing, what you want to be at. In reality, you're probably not at 35. I've never experienced a fire department that is at full staffing, a paid on-call department that is at their full staffing level. And so in other words, if you only have 30, because that's all you're able to attract and retain on an ongoing basis, then you're budgeting for 35, then you're setting aside more money than you actually need. And the last reason is replacement cost. You've assumed, in this case, for example, turnout gear is $2,850, but in reality, costs haven't risen that much, and it's only $2,000, right? And so there's probably, when you look at each of the, there's hundreds of line items listed in the CIP. There's probably a combination of all these that are being done. I go through all of this explanation because it's important, because capital is such a large portion of your budget. Some of the decisions that you're going to have to make in the future are related to how do we plan on keeping budgeting for those capital needs. Are we going to keep doing what we've done, or are we going to make a change? And so for analysis purposes, I'll just highlight this now. I also have one called mid-CIP. And so what I did with that one is I basically just took the $222,000 that I mentioned that CIP says, and I took the historic, which is the 77, I divided those in two, and I got $149,000 as my example. So no logic there other than saying, well, the CIP plan is probably too high, but maybe of what you've been replacing is probably too low. I got to pick some number, so let me just take the average of the two. So that's what we did there. Okay, so findings. This is what you've all been waiting for, right? You've probably all been waiting to go to Berg Days, and you're stuck here listening to some guy talk about numbers from an accounting firm. It's like, whoo, how did I sign up for this gig? Some of the things that I think is important to do before we talk about the findings is thinking about what are some of the questions that the board should be asking, and ultimately receiving impact from the constituents. And the one is, what do we need to invest in? And so we've talked about our additions, weight adjustment staff changes, additional staff time, new buildings. Some of the decisions that you'll have to make based upon the numbers that we present are which ones are we going to do, at what level, when, do we need it, do we not need it, et cetera, right? So those are always the revolving, that's the challenge of being a board member. You have to make those hard decisions. The other one is your fund balance goal, right? So I talked about that a lot before, but your fund balance has been doing this, and if I just, again, make an assumption, your fund balance is going to continue to go up and up and up and up, if we made no changes. And so what is the appropriate fund balance for the authority going for in the future? To make that decision, you need to think about a number of things. You need to think about making sure that you have enough money for those planned expenditures. So I know I need to have a $1 million expenditure for a fire truck, let's say in 8 years. I need to make sure that I have enough money set aside for that. I can't go too low. Now, keep in mind, though, that if you have really large expenditures, $1 million is a very large expenditure, so you could even do it for that. But you may want to consider on some of your more largest ones, i.e., a new fire station, that you might need to bond for those. So you can balance that fund balance with bonding as well. The advantage, a lot of people think of bonding. So what bonding is it's the local government issuing debt. and that debt then is used to pay for the item. When we think about our personal life, we think about debt is bad. In municipal government, debt is not bad. Debt is actually good because it allows you to leverage something that you might not be able to do otherwise. And it also puts your payments in a position that you can afford those over time. And then lastly, those people that are getting the benefit of the new item, a new fire station, if those residents then get basically they're paying for it as they receive the benefit of the service. So in other words, if I live in your community, and I've lived in your community for 20 years, and you are taking part of my tax dollars to set aside for that new fire station, and then I decide to leave, and the next year you build the new fire station, well, I never got any benefit for that. My tax dollars were used to pay for it, but I never actually get the actual benefit for it. So the advantage of bonding is if somebody new moves into the community, they're going to pay for it as they get the benefit. So a lot of times we think about debt. Debt's bad. We don't want to stay from debt. But I think, again, it's important in the municipal government. We need to know how to leverage it smart in a smart fashion. So the other thing we want to make sure on our fund balance and our fund balance goals is make sure that we don't have large changes for our funding municipalities. It's very difficult to budget for the constituent municipalities, and the more we can keep what their contributions are at a nice, steady rate that they can plan for in the budget, makes their job a lot easier to ensure that they have resources that they can afford to the fire authority. And so, again, your fund balance policy, if you go too low, then you might all of a sudden have big changes in terms of what they have to contribute. That's going to cause, frankly, political turmoil, as well as stress on those other local governments. And then the last, I mentioned this before, is making sure you don't actually have more money than you need. This is other people's money. We got to make sure that we're using that wisely. And so there's no magic bullet for what this would be. When I looked at the information, and this is probably not extremely scientific, but I would say that your fund balance probably could be anywhere from the range of 85 to 150%. Again, you guys are well over 225% now, and so you have some abilities to lower that fund balance, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so before we talk about the specific findings, I keep saying that phrase to set the stage, but this is, I'm going to show the slide again after I go through each of the scenarios, so don't concentrate on all the numbers, just concentrate on the current 26 numbers that I pulled from the data that was provided to me to kind of give you an idea of what the existing 4 municipalities are paying. And so this is going to be important because as we look at the other scenarios, you're going to see how things change. So for whatever community you're in, kind of key in on that brownish color there, and you can kind of see as we do changes, if you can remember that number. Okay, so what did I do? So what I did is didn't just do a straight forecast. I developed a forecast that allows you to, it's a spreadsheet, so the authority can have the spreadsheet and they can run the scenarios and make the changes they want to change. And because it's scenario driven, you can make some assumptions, you can change things, and to see what the impact is. And in this case, if we look at the bottom box, the bottom box down here is our forecast. And so when I talked about those numbers, for example, let's like Schoolcraft Township. So if I come back here real quick. So right now they're paying about $238,000 a year. In this first scenario, it would be about $312,000 a year change. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit as we get into this. But so what is this particular forecast? So this one is what I call stable. This is kind of status quo. This means you're not going to make any changes at all. You're simply going to keep, not make any new additions, and we're going to keep our fund balance kind of at the historic levels. And so historically, your fund balance has been about 46%, and so we're keeping that fund balance about 50%. So we keep kind of everything the same, we don't make any changes. This kind of gives you an idea of what those cost allocations would be for the municipalities. The next one is the same analysis, i.e. we have no additions, but in this case, I'm going to understand that I can lower my fund balance. So in other words, I can use my fund balance over multiple years, a portion of my fund balance, a small portion every single year, and get my fund balance down to 149% over time. Again, I do want to note, I should have mentioned this in the first one, the capital outlay I'm using is that mid-CIP, which again is the average of what you've been spending versus what your plan says. And so we can see here, for example, Schoolcraft Township, we're at 268%. This is less because our fund balance, we're using our fund balance over time. The next one says, well, wait a sec. What happens if we want to, we made a decision that we want to use all of our additions, all of the new initiatives that we want to add, but we don't agree with your logic on fund balance and that we can lower it. Again, we want to keep that at our historic levels we have, around 250%. And this shows you, again, what those contributions would be. Again, mid-CIP, et cetera. And the last one is, again, the same one in terms of all the additions, but we're going to use our CIP, use our fund balance over time to fund some of that, okay? The last one is, okay, let's be even more conservative. I don't know, I'm not saying this is the right answer, but let's say, yes, we do want to invest in everything, but the capital outlay that we have been spending historically is probably realistically what we're going to continue to spend in the future. This really doesn't include vehicles because vehicles are easier to predict, and so that's pretty much the same in all of these scenarios, or close to the same in all these scenarios. It's really those other items such as the communications equipment and the clothing that you have. This shows you what this would be. My fund balance forecast on this one is a little bit lower at 116% versus those, so that's probably a little lower. But again, that's making an argument that you could probably be anywhere between 85 and 150% and be safe. So that's why I kind of picked kind of the, not quite the middle, but lower than 150%. So again, this is kind of the most conservative view that you could have. So when we look at those, this again looks at all of these now in one page. So again, this is the same one I showed at the beginning. This is what you're currently spending. This one is our stable. So again, the maintaining on fund balance, and then our going to a fund balance goal. Again, stable means that we're not investing in anything new. This one includes all the additions. Now again, I can actually bring the spreadsheet up here and we can do it live, but if you want to say, well, we want to do 3 of the 5 additions, what does that look like? So you can change that, and that variable automatically changes and shows us the data. And then the last one is this most conservative one. And so if we look at the most conservative one, potentially the change for these municipalities would, for example, Schoolcraft Township, I'm picking on them, is about an increase of $62,000 over what they have been historically or what they would contribute in the current year, which is about a 26% increase for that municipality. So recommendations, and then we can go back and go through questions because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So the first recommendation is the CIP needs to be refined. Using not only the detail that you have today, which again is some of the best in the business, but also looking at what you've actually been spending and fine-tune it. For example, do we really need to calculate for 35 turnout gears when we haven't been using that? Make sure our expenses, because the way that the CIP looks like it's working is that it's just It was set originally back in previous years, and it just added to annually, and it's not necessarily revised every single year, which is it should be revised every single year. And so if we can get the CIP to more reflect what our future needs are, then we can get to a better number for that CIP versus me just picking this item that's mid-CIP. So in the short term, there's nothing you do about it, but the long term, your budgeting will be improved because of that. The second one is you got to determine what your strategic goals are. I mentioned it right at the beginning. Good decision making is made on good data, good planning, and good strategic directions. This is what the board needs to do with input from the public to make a determination. What do you want to invest in? What do you need to invest in? You need to set a fund balance policy. Fund balance policy basically says, okay, we're not going to just let it grow and grow and grow. We're going to make a determination of what we think the right fund balance for us. And maybe we pick Rod's 150%, maybe we pick 88%, maybe it's some other number, but you pick some type of number, and the value of that is then that helps you in future years make a determination of, okay, no, we can spend down some of our fund balance in future years. We don't need to increase the amount of money that the municipalities need to contribute, or no, my fund balance is getting low. I need to ask the municipalities for additional dollars to maintain that at that level. Because this is data, and data has assumptions in it, we need to make sure that we monitor that fund balance in the next 5 years, and then take a new look at this, and then make adjustments accordingly. You can evaluate a millage. This is probably really shouldn't be a recommendation, but my understanding is the statute that you're formed under, instead of having the individual municipalities fund, you could actually look at a multi-jurisdictional millage that would fund or individual municipality millage that could fund this as well. So just something to think about it. This is more of an accounting technical one. Right now, when you look at your audit, when you look at your budget, you use a concept of assigned fund balances. And so assigned fund balances is the board's recognition that we need to set aside money for future things like clothing and telecommunications, building and vehicles. Right? This is one of the things that, again, I do a lot of public speaking on budgeting. I tell a lot of local governments, you need to do this. You need to set aside assigned fund balances. It's a great way for planning purposes of not thinking about the current, but thinking about the future. In your guys' case, you have a lot of fund balances, and because you're authority, I think you could simplify, and I think you could, because of the way your guys' budget works, and as long as you have a fund balance policy and you have a strong CIP, you could simplify your accounting and simplify the recognition of that, because I think one of the things that's happened is you have all these assigned fund balances, but you're not actually using those, so they just grow and grow and grow. And again, you can just simplify it, and I think from a management perspective, a board's understanding perspective, it might simplify that. I would keep building and vehicles though, because buildings and vehicles are the biggest expense, they're the biggest numbers, and so setting some of that aside is important for that. And one of the things I recognize looking at the data is that historically, it didn't look like there was a strong use of investments. And I think last year, or maybe the year before, there was starting to actually invest some of the dollars. I would highly recommend to continue that. You potentially have the ability to invest even more dollars in that. The reason that's important is we all know that interest rates have been extremely high the last few years, and that is frankly another revenue source. And when we say investments, we're not talking about the investments that you and I can do. Municipal governments are limited by a public act called PA 20, which limits what you can invest in to ensure that municipal governments are investing in lower risk items. But the advantage of that is that if you're not taking advantage of investments, then in essence you have to charge the municipalities more money because you're not getting as much interest. Then that means that obviously then it impacts the taxation that eventually occurs. So just a tool in the toolbox to leverage and do intelligently. So that's the recommendation. So that is a lot, and I got through without having to drink all my water. So I'm happy with that. So what questions do you have, and how can I help refine?
I have some. I know. And I'm feeling good, quite frankly. I'm the author of the CIP, okay?
Wonderful.
And we put a lot of work into that, some of the board members here, and, what was it, over a decade ago? And we identified every single asset we had and the expected life and when it would die. And the intent was for it to be updated every year, like you said. So if we didn't spend what we thought on turnout gear, there was something that we fell short on. So move the money. When you laid that template over the fund balance, you would say, well, let's take it out of there and put it over here, you know? Because a lot of things changed over time. But the fund balance, you know, there's, I guess, the CIP template lays over that. You have unassigned and assigned. So that fund balance, when you lay the CIP over the top of it, you don't have nearly as much money just sitting in savings. So I don't know if you're saying the 85 to whatever percent or whatever it is, is that supposed to include CIP or
Yes.
not?
It includes CIP. So
Okay.
when I say fund balance, I look at what's called unrestricted fund balance. So unrestricted fund balance is a combination, this is way more technical than you need to know, but is your assigned fund balance, your committed fund balance, and your unrestricted fund balance.
All those.
And so the combination of all three of those
Okay.
is really what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yep.
Because, yeah, I mean, when we started that process, we had little to no fund balance.
Yeah.
And 2 engines failed and we needed $600,000 tomorrow.
Yep.
You know, and we had to run to the 6 units and we said, this is no way to run a fire department. So we started collecting in based on that CIP, right? So we would have the money when things failed to replace them, right? That was the intent. So and not knowing what things would cost 10 years down the road, you know, we did the best we could with that. And so it's put us in a good spot financially. That's great.
Phenomenal spot. And
Fortunately, I'm one of the people who's leaving.
Yeah.
The townships, but it leaves the fire authority in a solid financial position. So I feel good about that.
Yeah.
And
I want to make sure it's clear that it's not a criticism. It is a again, it's a high level of applauding because, again, this is one of the best ones I've ever seen. But like with any plan, it's a plan.
Yeah.
And plans have to change and adjust.
Yeah,
And so that's.
a plan is only to show you where things aren't really happening.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
But here's where a little bit I'm off on with your assumptions. You did a straight line on expenses, given the 2 leaving, you know, for the readiness, and I get that. There's certain things, you still have stations, you still have heating and the gas pump. Makes no difference if anybody leaves or doesn't leave, okay? But there is a significant chunk of, I think, money spent, and the formula drives that out on the usage, the 40%. When you aren't running, and it's quantifiable, if you look at the data, saying what was the usage for Cashman, what was the usage for Brady, all of that goes away. In April 1 of 2026, there will be no more runs. The gas for the trucks, you know, everything, you know, and it seems like there should be some quantifiable reduction in an expense versus your assumption that you just assume, nah, it'll just be the same.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that was the only thing that was being like, oh, I'm not sure I'm buying into that assumption. And that's it. That's it.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, again, I think there's going to be some reduction in expense. I mean, this is like anything. You can make multiple arguments, and they are arguments. We don't know exactly what happened. But for example, with you guys leaving, I don't know who you're going to go to for fire authority, but for the existing authority, the remaining authority, mutual aid may increase, right? For short term. Maybe long term it won't, but maybe short term. I don't know those types of things. I think we could put some things in there like fuel. We could probably reduce that. Demand time. We could look at those items that are variables and reduce it. But I think the important thing is it doesn't necessarily change the decision making on the overall numbers, right? It's going to tweak it a little thing, but it doesn't change the overall, like, okay, what additions does need to be added? What fund balance do we have to have? At the end of the day, the numbers It doesn't impact that
That's
decision.
what I'm trying to get my head around, saying, I mean, there's the day-to-day operation, like just fueling the trucks, things like that, but possibly 35 is the number, like you said, for the fire, you wanna have, but you don't ever really get. You know, but does that number change? You know, do you need the same number of turnout gear? Do you need the same number of whatever, equipment, that you currently are CIP'd for?
Yep.
Saying, yeah, but if you don't have, if you, 72 square miles of my area's dropping away, and all those calls, you know, is there across the board, both in equipment, is operational costs, whatever, is that some way to be, can it be quantified to say, you really don't even need as much fund, it's just another argument for saying, you could reduce this even further, you know? But I mean, I'm also the guy who says, let's be conservative and make sure we have enough money. So, you know, I'm not trying to drive this thing down, you know, I'm just saying, it just struck me as odd, that assumption, that's all.
The other assumption that you could make an argument on the other side, though, is that if I understand it correctly, this is a very desirable area in the state, which means your population's doing this, right? And so we've not taken into necessary account that increase in population, which is gonna do the same thing that we're talking about here, is that yes, while we're losing 2 jurisdictions, our population's growing as well at the same time. And so that's gonna have some type of impacts as well.
Yeah.
So that's the problems with these numbers, as you start playing with them too much, does it really change the information that the board needs for decision-making? And my argument is that, no, it doesn't fundamentally. Yes, I mean, I don't disagree. Could you refine them slightly? Absolutely. I don't think it makes a change to the decisions.
Okay.
I was, on what you said, Randy, like, you said something about, and I don't know numbers, Brad. This was awesome and overwhelming. You said, yeah, we looked at the 10-year plan and, you know, how can you see 10 years ahead? Isn't that to your point, Rod, that you said something about you look at the plan, but then you do a yearly evaluation of the plan
Yeah.
so that you can readjust, because
Yeah.
nobody has a crystal ball.
Yeah.
Am I putting those
Yeah.
2 pieces together in the
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, I think you have to stay on top of it. You have to go in there every year and say, yeah, we're not spending what, like you said,
Yeah.
we're not spending what we thought on turnout gear or whatever, and we didn't need
Sure.
as many. And we said we would do that, back in the day.
Sure.
When we started. You know, and like I said, but knowing full well that for every place where we were saving money or whatever, there was gonna be a line that we didn't hit the mark,
Yeah.
that we needed it for something else.
It's such a balancing act. I mean, I see that in my education world. I teach 5th grade in Schoolcraft. It's a projection into the future when you can't really, you just don't know. You're like, well, let's look at those 5 years that led up to this, but
Yeah.
you could have something that happens
Yeah.
and it's, now you've got a hole. So, yeah, for sure.
Well, and I think part of it, Randy, too, though, is our goal and the conversation we've had, and I've had this with Chief and that too, is we're looking at sit time, trying to do a better job of having staffing available
Right.
for better response times. And that's something that we never pursued in the past, that we've kind of made it a point that we're moving forward, that's a goal that we'd like to
Right.
achieve. So therefore, I think some of those monies and personnel becomes a fixed cost to us that we didn't have before.
Yeah, except the thing is, it's not gonna be fixed in that.
Well, it's gonna change, but still.
Well, I mean,
It's
it's a
more
recurring
monies.
cost. You're gonna
Yes.
wanna keep doing it.
Yes.
And so you're sitting on a bucket of money in your savings account that you collected that you maybe didn't need. And you could say, hey, that would pay for a year's worth of sit time, just to say something. But then year 2, that bucket's not there anymore, and so it.
But that's why we've had that discussion, to
Yeah.
have him put that in where you may not see some of that reduction, because was our goal, is to have that built in this 5-year plan for
Yeah.
us to be able to maintain that.
Right.
And moving forward, part of that challenge is staffing and the individuals that serve us so devotedly that we have enough people that they can still have their lives, and we hopefully can provide the product to fulfill the needs of the communities.
Right. And it'll offset. I mean, if it's true that I think that the costs, expenses will go down when 2 townships leave. I firmly believe that. I think the numbers show that. But when you throw on top of that, yeah, but we wanted to add sit time. We wanted to think about a new building. We wanted to think, and
Yes.
you know, I get it, then the price maybe goes to the back of what it was, or even increases, gets more, which is what these things show. But, yeah, I just wanted to make sure, to me, it was like, did you weight, did you weight, the leaving of the entities enough to offset some of those expenses or not? And I know it's just, there's no exact, I mean, you know, you're guessing at it, I get it, but,
One of the
but that's
things that-
something you guys will figure out. You'll figure out as
We're not
time.
gonna know
One of the-
till April
Yeah.
1st of
Yeah.
2027.
Yeah.
Then
One
we'll
of the-
know.
Yeah, yeah,
We'll
yeah.
have year tracking.
Yeah.
And we also are looking to increase their pay, as we noted on
Yeah.
there, to $20 an hour,
Yeah,
to try to get them comparable with other,
Yeah.
the other.
yeah, I firmly, if I was you, I 100% agree with you that, going on the conservative side, go ahead and go with the attitude that it's really not gonna reduce expenses that much. That'll just give you that much more money to pay for the
Flexibility.
things you would like, you know, so.
One of the things that I appreciate about this model, you talked about historical data. And so what this module's gonna do is it's gonna allow us now, to your point, Randy, to really hone in on this. And now, having this set up, we can now constantly look at this and get that great historical data that's going to be able to allow us to maybe, fine tune those numbers.
Yeah.
Um,
I think you use the example of, like, originally, you had a problem in that you didn't have enough money, you had to go to the municipalities, ask for more money, so you developed a good plan. Now we're looking at the plan saying, okay, we can adjust that. One of the things that I think is just fundamental when it comes to municipal government is that when you know better, you do better. And this is an example of this, right? Which is you're constantly learning and changing and adjusting based upon new factors, new information. This is complicated. If it was easy,
Yeah.
you wouldn't need to do it the way you do it, but it's extremely complicated. So, yeah, we know better, we just continue to do better.
Yep. Yeah.
Mind if I ask any questions from the audience?
Yeah, like the way I'm looking at this is basically what you've done is you've provided a tool, and they're gonna be able to take that tool, plug in the data that they find to be realistic.
Yeah.
To get them to the point where they need to be, and that's how I view this. I'm thinking that this presentation tonight gives us that great overview of how it works, but those may not be the exact numbers. I'm believing that that's gonna fall into your lap to where you guys can plug that in, figure out where you need to be, and we'll see where that comes up later on. That's my take on it.
It's roadmap.
It's a roadmap, absolutely.
And here's just an example. If you come in here and say, well, we're not going to do the new building, after all, change that to no, it changes the numbers, it changes the data. The only thing it doesn't just be, and I just don't want to oversell, is that the data in the back end in terms of revenues and expenditures, you could come in here and tweak it, but you're going to have somebody that's got some relatively stronger Excel skills to be able to fine tune it. But absolutely, this is something that you guys can have. Did I hear not it? Is that?
Oh, I thought my mic was off.
Anyone else? Any questions? Dan?
My question would be more for Tracy. Tracy, who's your number one response area that you have to call on? Schoolcraft Township, Vicksburg?
Schoolcraft Township.
Schoolcraft Township.
It's
Yeah,
right.
because they have US 131 north and south.
It's everything.
Yeah, okay, second.
What's Brady?
Okay, so we'll be cutting that out. Okay, third.
Village of Vicksburg.
Okay. See, I think when you figure in the factor, you also have to figure in the responses, the calls that are called upon on each community. You can do this, your numbers all you want, but that's got to be figured in. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, I'm sorry, I know Schoolcraft Township pays a big bunch, but they should because they have more area and more calls. So.
Yes, and the new, based upon about 41% school traffic contracts.
Yeah.
It's weighted, yeah.
Yep.
That's what that 40% of that formula is, it's 30 population, 30 taxable value, but 40 on the runs. And also that population is off the census, so it stays static for 10 years.
Okay.
Unless we have a midterm.
Yeah, so I mean, it runs.
Now
So
you-
really, the only big changes are really, because the taxable values tend to grow equally across the townships and the villages. So really, it's the usage that drives the change each year.
Yeah. Now, the census does put out a yearly estimate. So if you wanted to, you could use a yearly estimate, especially if one community is growing a lot faster than another community.
I think there was, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, again, I'm leaving, so, but it just, there was some good feelings in the stability of it. There, what it does is it flattens out the peaks and valleys, right? It says, the population is 10 years, so it just runs, and I don't see that. I know in 10 years it'll bump me, the formula will play with my bill, but my bill isn't jumping all over the place from year to year. I mean, because the only thing that makes it jump right now is the usage.
Yeah, and now that I say that, the midterm census, or the every year census, because you have, villages and townships are unique, because the village is part of the township.
Yeah.
That's right. And so I don't, actually, now that I say that, I think the only thing you can use is the 10-year, because I don't think it will allow you to break out with the population that would be of the village.
Yeah.
Ron, Ferrucci. One thing, every time something like this comes up, huge like baseball, Vicksburg Village watch, this group, okay. Every month, every third Wednesday of the month, there is a fire board meeting. And for the last 8 to 10 years at least, I've been to almost all of them. There are a couple faces, three faces that I recognize that we're the only ones there. Okay. You can't hear about something like this and all of a sudden raise a big fuss and be all offended if you're not taking an active if you're not taking an active part in all of the events that are leading up to it. Okay. I'm not even sure, I don't know a lot of people's faces, if all the people that are hubbub and comment on Facebook are even here. So this, it was an informational thing about one part of it. Okay. All of the business spending, this, that, and everything else is done at the fire board meetings. If you have that concern, that feeling, wanting to be a part of it, go to those meetings. Are they all exciting? No. Are 80% of them? Wow. Yeah, but you know what? You can't just, if you haven't been at least taking your active part in the governance of your community.
Thank you for that.
Do me a favor, please go on Facebook tonight and let them know that this is on YouTube so they can go on and watch it.
Oh, yeah.
So then that'll clear all this
My
up.
hope would be that all you board members would promulgate that through your.
I don't
sites.
troll on those sites, so I
No,
shouldn't.
I'm just saying, even though you're you're in this college posting.
I appreciate that, and I don't even mind if people get, I do really, encourage people to come ask questions though, going to the point where Rod, all the assumptions, this is based on a lot of assumptions, and assumptions, as you said, could get us in trouble. So, people have assumptions, come ask questions, email, just come wanting to know the answer, not assume what the answer is. So I appreciate what you said. Thank you for that.
Well, it just frustrates me when people.
I know.
Out of
It's-
ignorance. If you do it out of knowledge,
Sure.
bring it on. If you do it out of ignorance,
Yeah.
stop.
Thank you for that.
Yes, I'd like to just take an opportunity here to pay credit to the current board and all your predecessors. You didn't get into a good position, and I see this, even though it's, a plan and it's gonna change over time. You're in great shape, given the circumstances, and you get credit for that, and all of your predecessors do too. It didn't just happen because somebody got serious 2 or 3 years ago or something. It's been going on for decades. And I take my hat off to you. Thank you.
That's very kind.
Again, as an outside person, I want to reiterate that. You know, I worked for the state of Michigan for 5 years. I worked with the worst of the municipal governments across the state of Michigan. There are a lot of them. My current job, a lot of the clients I work with are the ones that are struggling. They have problems, right? You guys are outstanding in terms of, I applaud you. This is not something that occurred overnight. This has been a mindset for decades of the priority, good decision-making, and so it makes, the advantage of this is that when you get to the decisions like today, it makes the job a whole lot easier. Because would you rather be in a position where, yes, we have money and we can make decisions and we make changes, or, you know what, we have no money, we can't do anything, it's chaos mode, it's emergency mode, and there are a lot of local governments that are like that around the state of Michigan. So, yeah, great job for everybody.
Anyone else? You're not birthdays is coming.
I was about 7, Randy's about to jump on the
It's-
seat.
you know, I wanna
wanna
take-
take- yeah,
I
thank
wanna
you.
take
Thank
the
you.
opportunity to thank you
very
for,
much.
and
Yeah.
the amount of time it took you to put this together for us, because I know we expressed our concern for some of the entities. Pretty big decisions going forward for these entities on the path for their financing their portion moving forward, because we have dollar amounts that are changing. Everybody has to make a plan going forward, and all that plan takes a year or so before it comes into effect. And
Yep.
just, I want to thank you very much for the speed and the efficiency at which you got this together for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, and Rod, thank you for being here. I'd be remiss, I want to thank the village for letting us have this here
Yeah.
tonight. And I want everybody to know, this is an example of a CIP program. When President Frisbee and I came on the council, one of the things we wanted to do was develop a new village hall municipal building, because what we had was woefully inadequate. In fact, when I got on the council, we were meeting at Brady Township Hall, which I said, why are we meeting outside the village? Over the last 5-6 years, we set money aside, we paid cash for this building. So just so everybody understands, it is possible. If you stick to a plan, it does work. So,
Well, with that, I want to thank everyone. Nice seeing all your faces, taking part, and with that, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thanks for your questions, appreciate that.